All right, welcome to the Youth-Led Research webinar on creating your progress monitoring plan. Thanks for joining us today. There might be a few more joining us as we go, but that's great. We welcome that as people come in. So as an introduction here, I'm Amanda Larson. I'm our Youth Initiatives Lead at NYLC, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar along with Joe Shantz to my I was going to say left, but it's right on the screen actually, who's our research coordinator, and our tech support today is Marcus Penny. There's a great picture of him there. So he'll be on chat answering questions and alerting to us if there's questions that we should be aware of that we're missing as well. So please feel free to interact with us through the chat box and questions as they come or additional comments, and we'll have moments when we're specifically requesting that as well. For the next 40 minutes, we're thinking. Yeah. Our agenda, we're going to do a quick line of introductions to see who's joined us for the webinar today, where you're coming from. And then the bulk of our content will be spent on what that creating a progress monitoring plan looks like. So we're covering 3 steps: setting SMART goals, which is really kind of pre-work, but wanting to review that, assessing the reach of the project, and then also assessing the change in participants. And then before closing out, we'll share a few additional resources that you can access later on as well. So to get started, like I said, we're going to start with an intro activity to get a sense of who's in the room. So I'm going to open up a poll right now that will be coming on the right hand of your screen on the bottom there. And there's a plethora of choices to let us know where you're coming from. So you can scroll down and please let us know which rule best fits you. So we'll take another minute here. Perfect. Okay. Oh, I was gonna say okay, but it's gonna give us a little countdown here. So in 10 seconds, so we will share those results. All right, so we have college students joining us, and mostly from community-based organizations and nonprofits. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. It's good to get a sense of who's in the room, if you're coming from school-based or not, if you're adult or youth. And one more question to get a sense of who's on the webinar is your level of experience with this topic. So if you're new to research or if you're new to working with youth on research, obviously on the novice side, there's the expert side, or anywhere in between. And to let us know this, there is on the top of your screen a bunch of tools up there, and if you grab, well, I don't think the arrow one. I think that the one that looks like a pencil is probably your best tool to mark an X somewhere along the lines. Let us know where you think you fit in terms of level of experience with youth-led research. And we'll wait for a moment for people to let us know. All right, someone kind of new to the process joining us. If you're still looking for tools, again, it's up above that logo for the Generator School Network. And there's one that looks like an arrow, there's a T, there's a pencil. You can grab any one of those pieces probably. It's not letting you grab the tool. Good to know. All right, well, maybe use the chat box and let us know what level of experience you put yourself on. Joe is somewhere in the middle. We'll move on. If you could let us know your role through the chat box, that would be not your role, but what level of experience you have, that would be great, just so we have a sense. Just to keep in mind here, we'll move on to this next slide as we introduce this process. But just wanted to state, as we passed on to Joe here, that this webinar was originally intended with a youth audience in mind. And Joe's looking at me, wait, I was going to say that. But so if you are joining as an expert, please feel free to share additional comments or resources, but also keep in mind that be thinking of your role as a coach and how you can share this information with youth as well. So it looks like several novice and introductory, and some joining with additional experience as well.
Oh, and yes, the webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it later.
Great. So I'm actually going to take us off camera now as we dig into the content so you can focus on the slides. But again, feel free to continue sending in comments as we go. And Joe.
Okay. So today's webinar will guide you through a 3-step process to help you evaluate and monitor the progress of your service learning projects. It's been, as Amanda said, it's been designed primarily with the youth audience in mind. So if you're already an expert, though I don't know that we had many of them, we hope this can kind of serve as a primer for how you might incorporate more youth or more youth voice into that work. So feel free, as always, to send us comments through the chat box at any time. Amanda's going to start us off with the SMART goal identification process.
Okay. So just to set this up, we said this on the front end, but really before you would develop a progress monitoring plan, this was assuming that students would start with SMART goals at the beginning of the project. And not sure what level of familiarity each of you have on SMART goals, but we're just going to give it a quick review as some questions and tips to help guide students in thinking about how to plan their projects that really create those benchmarks for what you're looking for in a progress monitoring plan. So with SMART goals, if you're not familiar with the acronym, it means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. There's some versions of this that use those letters a little bit differently, but those are the ones that we'll be using for our conversation today. And going through each of these a little bit, so in order to know what to measure, goals should first be specific and really getting down to those questions that are on the screen in terms of the what, the why, the who, the when, the which. So this is about the more specific the goal is, really the more tangible it will be, and be able to know what you're looking for. So as the example here that we'll continue to build off on these screens, not necessarily a service learning project, but just a more personal one of I want to learn a new language. A more specific one would be I want to learn to speak French. And we'll see this develop through each of these as well. So think about if a student were to come with a goal in mind for a project, what questions you might ask to help take that a step further. So specific, then measurable, and thinking more about how will you know if you're close to accomplishing it. And so these could be asking questions, how much, how many, and again, when will we know it's accomplished? So it's not just I want to study French, but I will do this by doing an hour a day, and by the time I'm done, I'll be able to read the French news. So you'll know that you've met it when you're able to read the French news. SMA, attainable. How can the goal be accomplished is essentially what this is. So you want a goal that is a bit of a challenge, but not one that is impossible. So sometimes it's a matter of whittling it down a bit from a very lofty goal, or helping to make sure there are steps in place that can be attained within that time frame. So with I want to learn French, and the next month maybe that's not completely possible, but over the course of the next year there might be a level of French that you could attain within that time frame. The R is relevant, so thinking about is it worthwhile to you personally or to the organization? So is that project goal relevant to the students in the classroom or into the community? And also, is it the right time to do it? Maybe it could be relevant in a few months, but we're not quite there. And so it's with the example, this is specific to why is learning French meaningful for that person? But again, in a service learning project, it would be more about why is the project relevant to the student participants or the community members. And finally, the last piece of setting a SMART goal is that it's also time bound, so that there's something set on there in terms of what is the deadline and what can you accomplish today, this week, this month, within the next 6 months, or however long that time period lasts. And it looks like the example isn't up there, but so I want to learn French becomes I want to learn to speak French by the time I travel there in November 2014. So something specific that you can build a timeline back from in terms of what are those benchmarks along each step of the way. So if you're familiar with this, or you're an expert with this, but putting this into practice a little bit, imagine that a student comes to you with an idea for a service learning project and says, I would really like to start a mentoring program for elementary students. So using the chat box now, what might you ask as prompting questions to help get that more to a SMART goal? We gave a lot of questions away, but think about your own style and your own students about how you might take that a step deeper. What would you ask whom? In terms of if a student came with this example of a service learning project idea to start a mentoring program, how would you coach your own students to get them to a more specific? Yep, so what age of students? Yep, what are they going to be mentoring on? How many students? Exactly. So it's really starting to focus in on each of those pieces within the SMART. So it's a helpful acronym for students to use in setting those goals on the front end. From there can start to build out the progress management plan of how will you know when you're successful in reaching those goals. So we're gonna move on to the next step here from SMART goals. That was just a quick review before we go into the actual progress monitoring plan. But if you do have questions on that, please send them in now. We'll make sure to leave time for responding to questions at the end. But as we complete the first section here on step 1, SMART goals, send in questions if you have that. And I'll pass it to Joe to move on to step 2.
Thank you, Amanda. So after you have thoughtfully developed those SMART goals, and before you begin the work of your service learning project, you should think a bit about how you're going to track the progress towards those goals. As Amanda mentioned, your goal should include specific indicators of success. For us, at least, these indicators often come in the form of an output. So an output, as you can see there in the definition, is the product of your efforts. It's usually expressed as a quantity of something in a certain activity during a specific time frame. This is the M component of your SMART goal. So by tracking the outputs, you'll be able to measure your progress towards those specific goals. You might notice that you, for example, have performed 100 hours of after-school tutoring, which would be 50 more than you had planned. You might also notice that you've only collected 25 pounds of recycling in any given week. So you might need to rethink your strategy. Not only is this data helpful during the project, it'll also help you to evaluate your success after the project has finished. Just like keeping an ongoing record of your high school successes makes it easier to apply for college, keeping a running total of your project outputs will help you to demonstrate the reach and impact of your work when all is said and done. The examples you see on the screen there, the one on the left is a really simple example of an output tracking form that we use here at MYLC to track the activities of the youth who participate in our National Youth Leadership Training Camp. The form is completed online on a regular basis, and it helps us to better understand what activities our participants do and then how successful they think they were at reaching those goals. It also gives us useful information about the number of categories of youth and adults they've served, which you can see down here. The form on the right here, is an example of our Project Ignition program output tracking form. So twice during their grant period, they complete a report which tracks the number and type of events, as well as the number of youth and adults present. They also use this form to report on social media efforts, so tracking things like tweets and blog posts and Facebook likes. So these numbers, after you've collected them, help us as an organization better understand the reach of our efforts with young people. For the youth we work with, these numbers allow them to track their progress towards those SMART goals and help them demonstrate an impact in their schools and local communities. So the third step in the process, after you've identified SMART goals and assessed the reach of your campaign, would be to assess the change. This will involve attaining the feedback of your participants about the quality and success of your initiatives. So in the next few slides, I'm going to give an overview of some of the most common research methods used to assess the change of youth-led service learning initiatives. Typically, we think of these tools being used for summative assessments at the very end of a program to evaluate its success, but they can certainly be used in a formative assessment, which helps you to understand progress towards goals. Reevaluate your strategies, identify new areas of need or concern. So most of the methods I'll cover today fall into the category of primary research. That is, they collect data firsthand from program participants. Secondary research, however, which is on the slide here, takes advantage of existing data sources and ongoing research efforts. So it can be useful as a very first step when you're setting those SMART goals to help you assess the needs in your local community. For example, you could research local crash statistics, as many young people in our PI program have done. You might notice that many are caused by drivers using cell phones, particularly amongst new drivers. If your project continues long enough, you could look at the same secondary data to assess the change in those statistics. It can be difficult to say that your specific efforts prompted this change, so be careful not to imply direct causation, but you will probably need to do further research to find out whether or not you have directly impacted those behaviors.
And just to jump in on this one, Joe was specifically talking about teen driver safety projects, and other secondary sources that we had talked about is in terms of like achievement data at school, or how many students report to disciplinary acts, or what the graduation rates are. So looking at information that already exists out there to build off of and knowing what their impact of their project might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another tool that many of the young people in our NYLT camp and Project Ignition use are surveys, which they often use to better understand the values, beliefs, and attitudes of a particular population. The biggest advantage to surveys is that they are generalizable. That is, they can tell you something about a much larger population, let's say an entire school of 1,000, by surveying only a small fraction of that, about 100 to 250 students. That is, the survey sample, the people that you provide the surveys to, have to be representative of the larger population. So they should have similar breakdowns of gender, racial and ethnic categories, age, things like that. If that's the case, then the results of your survey will not only be representative of the people you've given the survey to, but also the larger population, in this case, an entire school. To get at these values and beliefs, a good practice is to use multiple questions to get at one particular topic. Let's say you're interested in finding out student satisfaction with their teachers. You should try to include several questions which get at that concept of satisfaction. You might include things like treating everyone fairly, having high expectations, and offering to help outside of class. We call this a scale when you use multiple indicators of one particular concept. It helps to kind of level the playing field. It will help you account for varying perceptions or interpretations of the questions, um, but they should all measure the same, it's called the latent concept. They should all be measuring teacher satisfaction. So they should all be similar, which will indicate the skill is reliable and it is an accurate measure of the concept. As most of you know, however, surveys can often be difficult to get responses to, particularly if the survey is very long or has very detailed or personal questions. So you may need to offer an incentive, which doesn't necessarily have to be large or expensive. Just by handing out a piece of candy when people take the survey creates a sense of debt. So they're more likely to fill out the survey, and then by promising to give them another piece of candy when they return the survey, will further encourage people to give you their responses. The difficulty with survey, however, is that multiple choice and yes/no questions aren't necessarily the most creative way to gather feedback. Especially if the survey is done online, respondents don't really have a way to express confusion or frustration or more nuanced opinions. While you can include some open-ended responses, that is text responses, it will undoubtedly increase the length of your survey, and then you might see your response rate plummet because people don't really want to sit around for a 20-minute survey. So next slide. So to get at that deeper, more nuanced level of understanding, you might try some qualitative methods, such as interviews or focus groups. These will allow you a more personal and in-depth exploration of individuals' attitudes or knowledge on a given topic. Unlike surveys, these methods will allow you to ask further questions, we call them probes, to get participants to clarify their answers and develop conclusions. People's facial expressions in particular often give away the fact that they have something else to say, right? That they have something on the tip of their tongue, and that they might feel a little bit uncertain expressing it in a social environment, or they're often concerned that it isn't quite the answer you're expecting to hear. Probes like, could you tell me more about, or could you explain what you mean by, are an invitation to just spit it out and let the group know what you're thinking. Reminding all the participants in a focus group or your interview subjects that all opinions are welcome and the responses are confidential will also encourage them to open up and share. In focus groups, it's especially important that you remind all participants to keep the discussions private, to not share other people's responses outside of the focus group, particularly if the subject is sensitive or controversial. In general, when writing your reports, you should never include respondents' names in the report. I mean, it's generally okay to include people's quotes, but it shouldn't say, you know, Mrs. Johnson said, et cetera, et cetera. It's obviously not best practice. Focus groups, the biggest advantage for focus groups is that they allow a facilitated dialogue between participants. So participants are able to ask questions of each other, they're able to respond to each other's statements, and they're able to ask questions of the moderator. So they can say, you know, I don't understand the question, could you rephrase it in some way, which they wouldn't necessarily be able to do on a survey. The moderator's role is to kind of balance this open dialogue and these questions and chatter with the need to get your own questions answered. The moderator should also attempt, if at all possible, to encourage quiet or shy participants because in a focus group, it can quickly get biased if one or two individuals are dominating the discussion. The moderator, however, shouldn't try and control the conversation. So you shouldn't ask leading questions, that is, questions that imply a correct or incorrect answer. As a moderator, you should always be willing to move on if no one's, taking the bait on a question, or you should always be willing to accept an answer you weren't necessarily planning for. Another benefit of focus groups. Unlike a survey, focus groups and interviews allow the interviewer to also take note of inadvertent or nonverbal responses, like body language. The tone of your voice, and facial expressions, as I said. These will often give you the first clue that someone is uncomfortable, or they have something else to say, or they really have no interest in the topic. Unfortunately, a focus group or an interview is very much like a laboratory. It's a controlled environment. The participants are likely quite uncomfortable. They've met new people. They're not necessarily open to discussing their values, beliefs, or behaviors. In fact, they might even try and distort the truth by giving answers that are what they think to be more socially acceptable. It's particularly evident when inquiring about risky or potentially dangerous behaviors. The example I think of is with our project ignition teams. People often ask about safe driving behaviors, which is one subject on which people are very tempted to lie about how often they use their seatbelt or how often they use their cell phone while driving. This is called social desirability bias, and it can permeate respondents' answers to interviews, focus groups, and surveys. So one way to get around this social desirability bias is to perform some naturalistic observations or observing individuals in public spaces as they carry out routine behaviors and interactions with other people. If you ever engaged in people watching at the mall, you've done naturalistic observation, but it needs to be done with a little bit more care and planning if it's to help you understand the impact of your project. You need to identify those behaviors that you're hoping to change, or what we would call target behaviors. One of your SMART goals might be to increase crosswalk safety in a school zone, something that our PI teams tackle quite a bit. By observing the behavior of pedestrians, you might notice, as you do your observations, that very few people cross at crosswalks. You might also notice by observing drivers that very few of them are willing to slow down or stop for pedestrians. So amongst you and your team, you decide to install an electronic flashing crosswalk, which will warn drivers. You also decide to carry out a PSA campaign that can help pedestrians better understand the risk of not using crosswalks or jaywalking. So after that's done, or after those initiatives have been in place for a while, you can carry out the same observational research. Hopefully, the changes you see in driver behavior or pedestrian behavior are possibly a result of your safe driving behavior efforts. Best practice says that you should perform these observations at generally the same time and place to control for other factors that might affect their behavior. You should do your observation in front of the same school at the same time of day to control for things like traffic or school opening and closing. You should also be careful to be as inconspicuous as possible so that you don't affect the behavior of the drivers or the pedestrians. People are generally a little wary of others standing around with clipboards, so that's usually a no-go. You can purchase very cheap clickers, like you might have seen lunch ladies use. Having one in each hand will allow you to count pretty rapidly the number of drivers you see, blowing a stop sign or using their cell phones. So yeah, try and be as inconspicuous as possible. Okay, so before we conclude the webinar and open up the floor to your questions, I have a final word about human subjects protection, a very important but slightly pesky aspect of social research. So when you undertake research of any kind with human participants, it's important to protect them from undue harm as a result of your research. At the beginning of their participation, you should make sure that everyone is aware of any potential benefits to participating in your surveys or focus groups, as well as any potential risk. And you should do everything in your power to make sure that no one, or to minimize those risks as much as possible, or entirely if you can. This means you should ask for consent before you distribute surveys, particularly if you're working with young people. You should protect the anonymity of people in your focus groups by not using their names. And you should only do observations in public locations. Before undertaking social research of any kind, particularly as it relates to youth or in a school environment, I have to insist that you must consult an adult with knowledge of your local school or organization policies regarding data protection. NYLC, Amanda and I, we can provide guidance on the appropriate research methods for your progress monitoring plan. We can point you in the right direction for help designing surveys and interviews and performing the analysis. But you and the adults you work with should take primary responsibility for protecting your research subjects.
Yeah, and helping the students that you work with to know that as well. It's a piece that students might not be aware of in thinking about those pieces.
Yeah. Okay, so the link you see there is a link to a Pearl tree, which is a collection of links. And I've done it on the wrong computer. Yeah, so this is the Pearl tree, and I provided a link on the webinar, but it'll also come up in the follow-up email that we'll be sending, which will link you to the recording of the webinar, as well as our contact information. But this Pearl tree, as I said, is a collection of links organized in a pretty attractive way. But so each of these trees, as they're called, will direct you to further resources about designing surveys or reporting and visualizing the data that you've been able to collect. So these are resources that I found useful. If you have any other ideas, I'd be glad to see them in the chat box, and I can add them to my Pearl tree.
Great. So as we're kind of heading towards sharing some additional resources here, but if you do have questions, this would be a good time to send them in so that those are answered before we close out the session today. And I'll quick peek at Marcus to see if has any come in so far that we should be addressing. No questions? Okay. Feel free to continue sending them in if you have. But to offer some few additional resources, as we said earlier on, this webinar will be recorded and saved on the Generator School Network, and the link is there right below that for the online community that we have that's for learning, planning, and connecting around service learning. So there's both this recorded webinar, but also you could do a search for evaluation or something of the sort. Progress monitoring would get you additional resources on this subject. And then below that, LIFT is a multimedia tool that helps show these different aspects of service learning that make it a quality experience, one being progress monitoring and really bringing those to life for what that looks like and how you can bring it into your own practice. So at that website, lift.nylc.org, is a whole bunch of resources, videos, and downloadable tools. So specific to this webinar would be to go to that website and click on the progress monitoring module to see videos of other schools doing this really well in their own service learning experiences, and then also resources that can help you plan that and take it further in your own experience. And then we always have webinars going on here as part of the Generator School Network, so there are several coming up to look for. just in a couple weeks is one on technology and service learning. There's also one on developing partnerships soon after that, and then developing a publicity plan for service learning in March, as well as another one on evaluation in May. So they can find information about all of them at nylc.org/all events at that link there, probably where you found this webinar, and register for each of these free opportunities. If there are no questions, you can feel free to follow up with us afterwards, after the webinar as well. Marcus will go ahead and send a follow-up email that will include both Joe and my email addresses so that you can follow up with us as needed. And as soon as we close out here, there will be a survey to rate how this went. So please do fill this out and let us know your feedback so we can continue to provide quality professional development opportunities in the future. And there is a question that popped up, so we'll wait to answer this for a second before closing out. The question was, would you say that monitoring is a more detailed way of thinking about evaluation as the project progresses?
Should I answer?
Sure. Go ahead and start.
Yeah. I would say, and the way we traditionally think about it at NYLC is that monitoring and evaluation very much go hand in hand. Typically, we think of monitoring as a formative process, that is, it happens during the project or the initiative. Evaluation is generally a summative process. It might happen, before and after the project, or 5 years after the project. Both of these things help you understand the impact. Really, the difference is in phrasing, I think, but yes.
Yeah, I think of monitoring as that ongoing piece of how do you know how you're doing in progress now? How are you measuring up to those SMART goals? Are you where you are, within the time frame? So, yeah, thanks for your question, and thanks for joining us. And feel free to follow up with additional questions after the webinar as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.